welcome to episode 142, the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
All right, you usually preface that with some kind of weather report. Not getting it today. I assume that just means it's pleasant.
Cool but sunny.
Yeah? We're doing this in an odd time of day. Usually you and I are doing this late in the evening for a release the next day. This one felt a little more urgent, so we're hitting it around lunchtime, which is obviously going to influence not only the weather, but also the drinks. Boringly, Dave, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking my usual Monster Energy Zero Ultra in the white can.
Yeah,
it's the best.
Well behaved. Me too. I'm sad to say, I've got a black coffee here, but it'll be more fun tonight, but not today.
I think I'm going to take it easy tonight and then get crazy this weekend.
Well, that's right. Yeah, you've got a spooky weekend ahead.
Yeah, we always have a big party on Saturday night for Halloween or in advance of it. So I'm looking forward to that. It'll be fun.
I know. It's my favorite time of year for that sort of thing. It's just, we have to wait till after dark. Speaking of dark, you've picked a really good song for us today, apropos of the topic. You want to talk about that?
I didn't even consult with you about this. I just chose it because I knew you'd agree with it. Yep. It is the essentially the title track off the My Chemical Romance album, Black Parade, and it's Welcome to the Black Parade.
Yeah, it's funny to me to think that album's probably almost 20 years old now. But it's solid start to finish. Not my typical cup of tea, but I do like that album.
You do. I've actually heard you listen to it before and speak very positively of it, although you're not really a big My Chem fan.
No, nor did I even know that was an abbreviation that people used for them. So there you go.
You know, I still remember the first time I put it on and we were driving. We were actually outside of Hilton Head and you were like, turn this trash off. And I was like, this is not trash. But it wasn't this album. It was the album before it. So I'll give you a free pass. It's a little more screamy on that first album.
Thank you. Yeah, well, obviously we're here to talk about a sore subject for us both, the death of LSAT logic games. Before we do, though, let's get a little bit into the LSAT world, because there are a few things happening we should cover at the outset.
Yeah, the Black Parade of LSAT games leaving the test. So, John, let's talk a little bit about the LSATs that we still have remaining this year and starting next year. The one and only test left for 2023 is the November LSAT. The registration's already closed down. It's actually approaching us in a week and a half. It starts next Wednesday. Mm-hmm. The November 8th, week and a half away. And so 4 days of that, and then scores come out at the end of November on the 29th. And then the following LSAT after that, which you can still register for, is the January 2024 LSAT. And that is the registration deadline is the day after the score release for November. So it is the 30th of November. And then that test is in the middle of January on the 12th and the 13th. And then scores come out by the end of January on the 31st. About in the middle of the admissions window at that point. So still early enough to apply to every single school out there, but you're not in the early cohort anymore. You're now in the middle portion.
Perfect. Yeah. And I should note, too, that what we're going to talk about today does not apply to these two upcoming LSATs. We'll give you some timelines, obviously, on this, but if you're taking either the November or the January test, it's business as usual. I wouldn't say you can ignore this episode, but this particular talking point won't apply to you.
That's exactly right. And if you're taking any of those tests and you want some assistance, we're always running free seminars. There is one coming up on the 8th of November, right at the very beginning of that test, on comparative reading and reading comprehension. If you're taking the January or later LSAT, we are going through LSAT 101, our webinar that covers all the basics, on December 5th. And then on December 19th, we've got an episode on basic conditional reasoning, hugely useful in both logical reasoning and logic games.
Yeah, and that one actually is geared towards both of those sections. You'll see examples from each type, so that's kind of fun.
And I'll mention as well, John, that if you're taking that November LSAT, our crystal ball for both October and November is still available for free on our website. Go to powerscore.com/LSAT, and you'll be able to fill out a form and access that, and then we'll send a link to the recording to you.
Well, there you go. All right, man. We got right through that.
Fast and Furious.
Fast and Furious. Speaking of furious, let's talk about the topic today. I'm less than pleased to discuss the death of LSAT logic games.
Well, we knew it was coming. We knew that there was going to be a change of some sort. So let's just kind of like cover the details. We'll talk a little bit about what happened, why it happened, what has LSAC said about the switch, how does it affect you as a student, whether you're preparing for the test now or later. And then we'll just go over a few student concerns and questions that have kind of come out about the change, as well as how it affects some of the things that we actually do. But Jon, I'll start off with a very brief overview.
Yeah, let's give some background to kick this.
Yeah, what has happened? Last week, in fact, LSAC announced that the logic game section was being replaced. This section is also known as Analytical Reasoning. It's being dropped from the test. We'd expected they were going to try to come out with a new type of section, and they'd actually done field tests to that effect last December, and so the speculation was some kind of like baby game section or more advanced formal logic is in there, but they actually went a different direction. Perhaps a predictable direction in hindsight. They simply said, we're going to remove logic games entirely and replace it with a second scored logical reasoning section. And in making that announcement, one of the things they pointed to was, look, the LR section has been a component of this test for decades, years and years. And so we have had formats in the past that had 2 LRs. So we have a lot of data on this. We know that it works. And that is the direction that they are going to take with it. So the key thing, though, is to understand when that switch happens, which is not until August of 2024. So we'll talk more about this, but if you're taking the LSAT any time between now and June of 2024, your test will be in the current format: 1 LR, 1 reading comprehension, 1 logic games, and 1 experimental section. After the switch, your test will be composed of 2 scored logical reasoning sections, 1 scored RC, and 1 experimental of one of those 2 types. So everybody in the world is going to be facing LSATs at that point that are either 3 LR and 1 RC or 2 LR and 2 RC.
Yeah. I guess the first thing I'll say here, somewhat gratefully, let me see if I can interject a point of gratitude, is at least they didn't replace it with another RC. That to me would have been truly doomsday.
It's a low bar for gratitude. I mean, seriously, I agree with you. 2 RC would have been hell on earth. Instead, we get 2 LR, and I like LR quite a bit.
Too.
So this is not some kind of negativity about LR. I just like the 3 sections because it had it was a change up. It was something different, and I realized for some people that this announcement is the best thing they've ever heard, and for others, it's the worst thing they've ever heard. There's a real polarity of responses when I announced this last week.
We're definitely going to talk about that split too, what this means for students essentially in those 2 camps.
Exactly. Now, one of the questions that's come up is, first off, why did this happen? Why has LSAC made this change? And it wasn't a unilateral decision. They didn't just make it on their own. They were kind of forced into this corner. And Jon, you and I went through this 100 episodes ago. On episode 30, we talked about, is logic games going to go away? And at that time, this was 2019, they had 4 years to work it out. And here's the announcement. So this has been not just a new thing. This is no surprise. 4 years ago, we were talking about the fact they were going to make this change. And in very brief terms, LSAC has had problems with accommodated test takers over the years. And when I say they've had problems, they've created problems for themselves. They have not treated accommodated test takers fairly. The United States Department of Justice hit them with a consent decree and a fine over this. And then they still, I guess, didn't accommodate well enough, and they were hit by a lawsuit by 2 blind students. And the suit's called BINNO, BINNO, versus LSAC. And you and I, Jon, actually spoke with Jason Turkish, who was the BINNO plaintiff side representative. He had a lot of interesting comments about LSAC and how it operated and how rigid they were. But what ended up happening was, after that lawsuit had kind of been progressing, LSAC entered a settlement agreement with them in 2019 with the 2 blind individuals. And those individuals said that logic games was unfair because you could not do the section well without diagramming or drawing, and that disadvantaged them. And in that settlement, LSAC said over the next 4 years, we will explore alternatives to this section with an eye towards eliminating it. And so that's how we got to this point. So those of you thinking, well, why didn't LSAC do this or that? They put themselves in this position. And as I've said to you, Jon, it's like that quote from The Matrix. That's the sound of inevitability.
Yeah.
It was coming, and here we are.
Something was coming. I will confess a little bit of surprise, at least on my part, as to exactly what transpired here. Like you said, the field tests indicated they were going to replace this section with a different version of games. I didn't think it was going to disappear entirely to be replaced by something that was already existent. But here we are.
Yeah, there was a dream that I had about this, that they were going to replace this with a section that was primarily formal logic problems. And I was like, please bring that on. That sounds like the funnest section in the world for me. I don't know whether it's fun for people to learn about or to be taught, but I really like formal logic, and we have a really good system for dealing with it that can accommodate just about anything. And so I was really looking forward to the idea of having to put together material for that.
Yeah, me too.
That didn't happen. And that's simply the way that it is. I don't think that's the end of the world. My view has always been of logic games that it really does disadvantage certain people unfairly. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. Like, why didn't they accommodate some of these individuals? They made some errors along this. But let's take a look at what LSAC said about this switch. Because when they made this announcement, they actually sent an announcement to students, and then they sent an announcement to licensees. And I was able to talk to them as well a little bit about this. And they threw out a lot of data and stats about, what this change meant. And I thought they were very careful in how they worded this. And so let's unpack that a little bit, kind of get into it. But one of the quotes that LSAC had was that extensive research involving hundreds of thousands of test takers has confirmed that substituting a second LR for the logic game section basically has virtually no impact on overall scoring. They said that the analysis of those 200,000 test sessions found that the mean score changed by 1/100th of a point. And they've posted up some stats where they looked at 218,000 test events plus change, and that overall the mean score with the analytical reasoning was 150.82, and the mean score without it was 150.83. So just essentially statistically indistinguishable at that particular point. So their whole thing is that the majority of individual test sessions, now these are the individual sessions, changed less than 1 point. That's an interesting claim as well. And that essentially, on top of that, the revised test form will still have the same strong predictive validity, which is a message to law schools, not really to students so much. But it's interesting, Jon, that they say it's the mean score. They didn't talk about individual subgroups.
Right.
They just said, hey, on the whole, scores are the same. That doesn't mean that scores are on the same for each individual, though.
Yeah, I'd love to see the full distribution, the overall bell curve that we get, because I do have some suspicions as to how that might move or contort a little bit in the wake of this.
Yeah, I think, the amount of data that was released along with these emails was very minimal.
Yeah.
Hey, here's the 200 sessions. Here's the mean score. Here's the median score, which was 151 in both cases. Thank you. Don't ask questions. Goodbye.
I can't help but to think back to some of the language they used prior to the LSAT Flex getting released, where they said this won't have an impact on scores. This won't, make a difference. Despite the massive overhaul that we're doing from 5 sections down to 4, from 4 scored down to 3. And yet, what did we see? We saw a huge difference in scoring outcomes, particularly at the high level. We saw this massive score bubble immediately get triggered. Despite all of their, again, kind of passivity and forewarnings as to this won't make a difference. It did. This feels like more of the same. I mean, it's hard not to feel like this is just reminiscent.
No, this language is very similar to all of that. Hey, don't worry about it. It's all good. A lot of messaging to students about it's really something you're familiar with, and a lot of messaging to law schools. This test is still good and it's still valid. Remember, this is the Law School Admission Council. the first words are law school. It's not the law school, the law students or the prospective students. It is literally the law schools that are their main clientele. And so they needed to be able to say to them, hey, things will be just fine. Don't even worry about it, guys. This will be the same LSAT. It'll still help you out. And I think sometimes the rush to judgment in terms of, let's make sure that everybody's happy is very strong with them. Mm-hmm. I would prefer a lot more transparency with the data here, and we're not getting it. And I don't suspect that we'll get it until after the test comes out. And if you recall, John, during the pandemic tests and the flex, even when the data started coming out in, say, August and September about test performance, they were very staunch on this is not causing issues at the high. They will come down. They called me specifically to tell me that and to ask me why I disagreed with that view. And I'm like, well, statistics and numbers that you release don't support that. But they're like, no, but they will actually. I had a conversation with one of their highest officials on the morning of Thanksgiving to talk about it.
I remember
Crazy.
That. Yep.
I mean, absolutely nuts.
Well,
anyway.
Yeah, we're going to get more into this. This might actually be the only subject of some debate between the two of us, Dave, today, as to how we think this might impact scores or where we think the greatest effect will be felt. We'll come to that, certainly. But for now, LSAC's language here is pay no mind, pay no attention. Everything is business as usual.
Yeah, back to that in a few minutes. By the way, one of the questions that came up about this change was, why didn't they just make a separate special test for students who are visually impaired that doesn't have logic games? Well, they had that opportunity like a decade ago, and they chose not to take that. In fact, they were very hardline about it.
Yeah.
And the general counsel, who I think was, in my personal opinion, part of a lot of that, is no longer there. The people who caused this problem don't work there anymore for the most part. Some of them are still around, but I don't think the people who were in charge of the accommodations decisions a decade ago when they started getting themselves in trouble, a decade and more, are still around. They could have done this. They could have made this exception, but they would not do so. And so that is why Angelo Bino ultimately sued them, saying, you're not being reasonable. This is unfair. It's inequitable. So they're not going to do that now. Now they've made this change for everybody, not just one or two people. And I think it's a reasonable suggestion. I think it would have been a great thing, but that's not what they chose to do. And so it is gone, that option.
Yeah, it's too late now. So let's get into really what I think the heart of the matter is for most people listening to this, which is if I'm a student and I'm looking at an LSAT next summer/fall, what does this mean for me? How do I prep? What do I, anticipate here? What should I essentially do in terms of my game plan? Should I plan to take this with games still available to me, which means June 2024 or earlier? Should I wait, if I have that opportunity, that luxury, until August 2024 or later when the games won't be there anymore? How do you make that decision as a student? What does that look like?
Well, I'd say to me, it depends upon two things.
Okay.
Which can be separate, they can be related. So the two questions that really come up to me is, first off, which LSAT do you want or need to take? Here's the thing. This is based upon cycles. If you are applying this cycle, you want to apply to law school now and go to law school next fall, you don't have a choice. You have to take the current form LSAT. So if you take January, for example, and then you put in your applications and then you want to start attending in August, September next year, you're taking logic games. So that's the first thing. However, if you don't need to apply this cycle and you have time, then you have a choice. You can choose to take the current test or the new forthcoming test in August. And that brings us to the next question, which is, are you good at logic games or not? Which I think is the obvious question.
Right.
And this one is really clear. If you're good or logic games is contributing positively to your score, take it before August 2024. Take it sometime between now and June of 24. Alternatively, if time's not an issue and you're really not good at logic games or you fear the effect it can have on your score, take it in August 2024 or later. And you can see already online people having conversations where one group is flowing earlier and the other group is flowing later.
Yeah.
You see some indifference, but I'm seeing mostly people having strong opinions of like, what should I do? And so that to me is the litmus test, is what kind of time do you have in terms of your applications and whether or not you're good at logic games. Those two focal points should help you determine what your options are and what's ultimately best for you. Of course, there's other things that flow around that too, John. So
Sure. I'm going to reframe that very slightly to add one additional consideration, which is that I think a lot of people are getting hung up on who they are in the present.
Mhm.
Keep in mind, we're still, from the last LSAT with Logic Games, which is next June, we're still a good 7-8 months off from that test. So to me, the way that I would probably address that question is obviously consider who you are at the present, but also consider who you could be in the next 6 months. Because chances are very good, knowing the nature of Logic Games, and this is why I think you and I are a little bit bummed to lose it. This is the section that people who work hard and are diligent and have the right resources of prep, this is the section that they very often improve in the most to, for many people, the point of perfection. So the way that I would look at this as a student now is, do I have the opportunity to be good at Logic Games by next June? If so, you definitely want to make taking before August a priority.
Yeah, the growth factor, so to speak.
Yeah. You got to consider in the future as well as the present.
You got 8 months, let's say, to grow to be a great games taker. Some people know already. And, and when I'm talking about your ability in logic games, to those people who know, sometimes it's like, look, I hate these things. I don't want to study them. I'm never going to be good at it. Try to avoid taking, one of the next several tests then. But you are truly correct in the sense that when we look at LSAT students, we know that the greatest score increases within each section typically come from logic games test takers. It's the most foreign section to people when they first start studying for the LSAT. It is the most learnable because it is so systematic and structural. It repeats the same ideas that are often very easy to identify and account for. So there's a huge growth factor there.
Yeah.
If you've gone out on your first LSAT and scored like 14 right, you probably have the ability to shoot into the 20s. And so factor that in. Yeah, it might not have been fun. You might have done better on the other two sections, but that might allow you enough runway in terms of time to take an LSAT that's coming up in 2024 in the early part and end up with a really high score with this. There's a lot of questions around that, though, but I think that's a really good point that you make.
Yeah. One we'll elaborate on, I think, as we get into this next section of discussion, which collectively, we've gotten a lot of questions about this, a lot of concerns, obviously, from students. Let's run through some of those questions that we've been seeing. And you, I think, very wisely, went out and actually solicited some questions on Twitter earlier this week. So we'll include some of those as well.
Absolutely. And I got some good questions as well.
I saw some, yeah.
John, let's start with the kind of like one of the questions that I know that a lot of our kind of like representatives are getting, which is how should people prepare if they're testing somewhere in that summer period next year, spring, summer, fall, where it's kind of like somewhere between June and August. They don't know which tests they're necessarily going to take. What do they do?
Yeah, to me, the first thing to do is try to pick a target test date and study for that format. If you have that kind of, say, freedom or flexibility, I used the word luxury, I think, before. If you aren't sure you have to take the test by a certain date, I still try to plan to take it sooner as opposed to later. Again, if this is me, and I'm starting to think about this now, to take a test next year to start school in the fall of 2025, which is what this is ultimately geared towards, I'm looking to take a test probably April or June. That's who I am. I'm going to study games. I'm going to see if that section can become an asset for me, as it is for an awful lot of people. And then I'm doing air quotes around worst case scenario. If I have to drop the games that I've studied for because they turn out to be a hindrance or a detriment, then I go for August. But that's what I'd always start with, is look at the calendar, pick a test date, try to make it as early as is realistically possible, and then full speed ahead for that. You know you've got tests on the back end of it, but don't miss this opportunity for games if they could potentially be to your benefit.
Yeah, one of the other kind of considerations there when you're thinking about picking that test date, it's really crucial because when you study for a test with logic games, that's a third section to focus on in terms of type. If you do just the later August tests, you're looking at a 2-section kind of format. It's just LR and RC. So sometimes even the study time that you have, if you're like, I've really limited study time, not having to study logic games actually saves you time because you don't have to learn an entirely new thing. Now, you made a really interesting point there. You're like, look, if you go through, say, the April or June LSATs and you're focused on logic games and it turns out it doesn't work out or it's not, giving you the score you want and you get pushed into an August or test later, what's changed there? I mean, you've lost your logic games. How do you feel about it at that point?
Well, certainly some of the skills that you would have learned in logic games still apply. So it's not like you've wasted your time entirely. But, that's a natural pivot. Everything that you've learned up to that point in logical reasoning or reading comp obviously still applies, in fact, doubly so in logical reasoning. It consolidates a little bit what you do going forward, which I think most people could appreciate. It certainly narrows the focus. And again, you just drop a section that at that point you would have quantifiably, objectively learned is not going to be your best. And to me, this is really the measure. Is logical reasoning a better section for you than logic games? If you're getting more points in LR than games, take a later test. If you're getting more points in games than LR, take an earlier test. But that's the decision you would probably make in the spring or maybe early summer of next year.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point because this is almost like an ROI, return on investment analysis that's being done. And I know this relates to some concerns that I've seen students express already in multiple instances. And we were talking about this before, that we have students who are thinking about testing post-August of 2024, and they've been studying now for a couple of months. They've already studied logic games, and they're flipping out because they're like, I wasted my time.
Right.
First off, you still have a long time before a test in August. That's 10 months. But secondly, you haven't wasted your time in the sense that you're thinking, yes, you've spent time that may or may not get tested. But imagine that you've been doing logic games, and like you said before, you've learned that you really love them. Now that investment can pay off because you can move your test date up. Or conversely, you've been studying them for a while and you're like, I don't really love them. And now you're much more assured that taking August or later is the best choice. That so-called wasted time isn't wasted. You've learned something about your own abilities as a test taker, and that helps inform the choices that you make going forward. And then I will also always say this, and kind of echoes what you were getting at, which is there are skills in logic games that certainly apply to logical reasoning. So much of the conditional reasoning is tested in the logical reasoning section that is never a full waste. You may feel like, man, I didn't need to spend all those late nights doing the dinosaurs game or the computer virus game, and I feel your pain there. All right. So I'm not trying to diminish that. But at the same time, maybe those experiences taught you either I really can do this or I really can't. And the value of that is incredibly high.
Yeah.
So if you're talking to students, you're like, well, what do I do now as a student? I'm like, you need to determine whether logic games is going to be part of the plan going forward. If it is, full steam ahead on June or earlier. If it is not, stop studying logic games and go ahead and focus just on the other two sections. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the prep options with that in a few minutes as well.
Yeah, I'll be honest. To me, it's premature to stop studying logic games for the vast majority of people out there. And I don't say that as just a fan of the section. I say that as someone who knows that there's still enough time for really anyone to get good at logic games. Worst case, as we say, what do you learn? Composure, organized thought processes, that's going to help you elsewhere. But right now, logic games is still an opportunity for virtually everyone. Don't make this an emotional decision. Games are weird. Games are hard. I don't like them. You might not like them right now, but ultimately, how are you performing in 4 or 5 months? So to me, that becomes the decision maker. That's the real, tipping point.
Agreed. And speaking of that, that means that, the preparation materials that you're using are important. So let's talk about some of the things that we know from LSAC, as well as some of the things we know that we're doing that are out there. So we know this test change is coming. What's LSAC going to do? They have actually made a statement that says we will provide test preparation materials that mirror the revised test starting in, and drum roll, February 2024. Now, look, they're just dropping logic games. So what they're probably going to do in Feb 24 is release some tests that are simply the 2 LR formats. And that'll be nice. But if you're studying right now and you're going to drop LG, that doesn't change a whole lot for you. You still have several months before that comes into play. The thing that I would say is that you just drop logic games as a study point.
Yeah.
You don't have to do them anymore if that's the case. For example, with the PowerScore course, we've been getting the question of, what's the plan? I'm like, in relatively short order, we're going to release a series of LSAT, so to speak, that are 2LR, 1RC. With corresponding scoring scales and so forth, so that someone can go out and say, well, I want to take a test in the format that I have. And then obviously we're updating courses and so forth so that at some point here, we will be able to release versions that are no more logic games. And someone in, say, January or February who's starting a course could say, well, am I going to take a LG test or a non-LG test, and simply go into whichever version fits their preferences best. And, they could switch back and forth too at that point.
Yeah, we'll certainly provide options for both people. My guess, Dave, is that most people listening to this, at least at the date of us recording it right now, late October 2023, are not predetermined to a fall or winter test date of next year. It would be a little strange to me if people listening to this were like, well, I know I'm not taking it for at least a year, but I'm still tuning into you guys now. I'd be flattered by that.
They exist.
They exist, but I imagine they're scattered. I think most people listening to this are probably going to be on that fence, or are going to be mostly just in a curious consideration. I'm taking the test next, spring, but I am curious what it means when the games drop. For those people, again, full speed ahead with games. Take this test as though it's just the exact same thing we've been dealing with for years.
Agreed. And I think that's easy, simple, but also true advice. The best kind of advice.
That's my favorite kind of advice. Yeah,
exactly. So let's talk about some of the effects of this, especially for both the scoring scales, the percentiles, medians, and law schools, how all of that comes into play. And I think, the first thing that we can ask is anything going to change with the scoring itself of the LSAT or the scale?
Yeah,
and this is a simple no.
I thought you were asking me. I didn't know you were going to answer your own question. So
no, I was going to answer it because it was so fast. I was going to ask you the more complicated question that would force you to, actually do the work. No, it's still a 120 to 180. The scoring scale is going to be adjusted for the fact that there are 75 questions roughly, and that's what we have right now. They're going to expand a little bit because currently we see a lot of 75 question tests, and what they do is they have 23 logic games and 27 reading comp. Most of these LRs are 24 to 26, so we're probably going to see scoring scales that are now accounting for a few extra questions in them. So they won't look exactly the same as now, but they'll be really similar. That'll probably end up impacting some of the test predictions we make. We'll have to see some of the prep materials that they release, if that's going to start the baseline to get a 170 at -8, for example, or whatever the case may be. We don't know the answers to that yet because we haven't seen them do anything, but there's a few extra questions on these tests for the most part. Maybe 1, 2, or 3, depending upon the test format that they use with the LR. So I expect that we will actually see some small changes, but only by a question or two across the scoring scale.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. We're going to be looking at this really out of 78. I think it's going to be the new normal in terms of raw question count.
That is exactly right. So how about the score distribution inside all of this? We've gotten a lot of questions about how does this affect scores in the 170s? Is this the end of the scoring bubble? Will medians rise or fall? A lot of like headline news types of questions, almost clickbait questions, but in this case, they're not clickbait, they're real.
Yeah.
So let's go right away and talk about the score distributions. If you look at LSAC's information, they're saying that ultimately things like the mean and the median didn't really change. I think the nature of who's affected changes a little bit. But one of the things that I'm not sure that you and I disagree or agree on is what happens with that scoring bubble in the 170s and how are higher scores affected?
Yeah, this might be the point where you and I split a little bit. I'm of the opinion and the expectation, and we may never find this out. I should probably preface it by saying that this is entirely mysterious and black box until LSAT decides, if they do, to release some data. Right now, we don't have it. There's no guarantee we ever will. But my expectation is, given the nature of games, the perfectibility of games, you used the word learnable before, and that's a great word for it. Given how this section can ultimately become really the backbone for a lot of high-scoring people, just guaranteed 23 points, 22, 23 points. And logical reasoning and reading comp don't really work in the same way. They aren't quite so reliably, consistently perfect for most people, high scores even. I think we're probably going to see this really hit people in the upper 170s, the mid to upper 170s, the hardest. I know that if there was a section that would hurt me the most to lose, and I think it's probably true for you, this would be it. Losing games would be the section I'd be like, oh man, now I've got to actually think more. That would affect me. I don't know that my scoring outcome would be different, but it would change my performance, like the nature of it. I think for a lot of people, they're going to feel the same way. So my guess, Dave, is, and this may be where we part ways temporarily, is that you're going to see fewer scores in the 175 to 180 range. That's what I think is going to happen here.
I'm not sure I agree.
Well, no, I know. I've made that abundantly clear that was coming. But elaborate.
It all comes down to what you said here for many people. Yes, there are many people that will be, I think, adversely affected. I think a lot of STEM majors, somebody like a math major, engineers, these types who are very good at the kind of like the calculus of logic games, I do believe that they will be affected. The offset, as it were, is that I think there are many more people who are not STEM majors taking this test and who have a really very strong facility with reading and argumentation. And for them, losing the logic games is actually going to buoy their score up. Now, the big question, Jon, is the falling scores of STEM majors, the expectation that I'm saying, and the rising scores of some humanities majors is where's the balance point there? Where's the level? And it's hard to say. We know that logic games is learnable. I think logic games has been the kind of score that has stopped people from getting a lot of really high 170 scores. It didn't stop them from getting into the 160s or low 170s, but it stopped them from being perfect. With that removed, I think they'll be able to really shine and show through about, hey, we have the ability to get all these questions right. I just don't know what the balance is there. So I'm not certain that it is going to drop those high scores up there. I do feel quite strongly that it will change the composition of those people. That we'll see a difference there. And I don't think you disagree with me on that there's going to be some change.
You're going to have different people at those scoring points. That is virtually guaranteed. My take on this is if you're at a 165 or above, the majority of those people have got logic games essentially mastered to the point of perfection, and wouldn't say the same thing as a guarantee about logical reasoning. Those people now would have to deal with double logical reasoning, and they've lost the section that was perfect. That should naturally hurt them. I don't think you're going to see nearly as many people who are in the 165 plus range who are like, games was the thing holding me back. If that were the case for someone, and if you're listening to this and you're like, hey, but that's me. First of all, congratulations to your good fortune. This is, Christmas come early for you. Take the August test or later. But I think there are fewer of those people than the former type I described.
Yeah, and I think the other point we could add to this is that, logic games, even though it's 23 questions typically, it's really 4 big events. If you can lock into the 4 events pretty well, you end up doing, you typically will have a pretty solid performance if we're just talking about LSAT scores in general. Right. Logical reasoning, to me, the big challenge is the relentless pace of it. Let's say you have 25 questions in a section. These days, it's 25 different arguments that you have to analyze, different question stems for each one. And it's hard to be perfect when you have to go 25 for 25. It's a lot easier to me to go relatively strong 4 for 4 than it is to go perfect in 25 for 25. So you may see that the 178 to 180 drops slightly, but we still have really strong numbers in the low 170s and mid 170s. This is the kind of predictive stuff that'll be really interesting to look at when we get the data to start making comparisons and saying, well, look at that. And we know that from before, LSAC made a lot of claims about how scores would be just the same and it would be the same LSAT, and it wasn't. So no matter what happens, I'm there to see how it comes out. And certainly one of the big questions is we've had all these medians rising in the last several years for LSAT. Will this move that? We've just addressed the scoring bubble. Will the medians continue to rise, or will they stabilize, or will they actually drop? And I think we can probably say they're not going to continue to rise. I don't foresee that being the case. But will they drop at all?
Yeah, I think that's all pretty reasonable. I'm agreeing with you in part because it sounds like you've somewhat agreed with me. Maybe I'm just hearing what I want to hear. But that those really, really high scores may get impacted. I know you're going to have yeah, go ahead.
Look, I disagreed with you in the main, and I said, look, but that could still allow for a very high score thing. But when I talk about scores in the 170s in the scoring bubble, I'm not convinced that it's going to disappear. Could I see a few fewer 180s, 179s? Yeah. But that allows for a point of agreement between us, but not an entire agreement between us, which would sound like a good LSAT question.
We are a Venn diagram, as usual. As usual. Related to this, in fact, directly related to this, what do you think this is going to do to the scoring bubble? Have we just burst it?
No, I mean, I think you think it's going to come down a little bit, and I don't. I'm not sold on that idea. I also think medians are going to maintain relative stability. And, call me a skeptic or a cynic. I think LSAC has there are ways to engineer these things while still being fair so that the results look the way they need to look. They can't control it entirely, and they've told me, and I'll repeat what they've said, that they do not mess with test integrity, and I do believe that. But maybe, the person selecting the LR sections make sure they're a little harder. I don't know. That's just complete speculation. It's certainly nothing from them, nor would they ever say anything like that. They are very big about test integrity, and having seen it in action from them multiple times in terms of like test content, I do believe that. So it's more just kind of like tableside chatter than any kind of like real opinion on it.
Yeah, this is all speculative. Along the lines you said, maybe they select something that's harder. Maybe they select something that's easier. Do they change the composition of LR to include more, say, formal logic or conditional reasoning games type ideas? All of this remains to be seen. I don't think any of that's going to happen, though. I think this is going to be LR as usual, just times 2. And again, the question is, who does that help? Who does that hurt?
Yeah, well, let's say, here we have these scores that are on the 120 to 180 scale. The biggest question that comes in after that is, how do law schools look at this? Are they going to penalize students who took the August 24 test or later, or give them a bonus? Like, you didn't have to do logic games. We had to do more arguments. So we think you're a better test taker. And I will really address this in a very straightforward matter. They don't care. They do not care. We've already seen this in the last couple of years with the flex test via the pandemic. Law schools didn't care. What law schools want is an actual LSAT score. If they get one, they're happy. If LSAC tells them it's a valid statistical measure of performance, they accept that at face value and they move forward. So you're not going to be penalized for taking one test or another. You're also not going to be benefited by taking one test or another. Law schools are LSAC's clients. They tend to trust them. And in this case, they're going to treat these tests as entirely equivalent unless something really just out of control happens.
Yeah, completely agree. As a point of comparison, we saw this same question come up when the flex test was first introduced back in mid-2020. And people asked, are schools going to think less of flex test takers having only 3 scored sections as opposed to people who took it, say, in 2018, 2019, with more scored sections? And the answer that we gave then, which turned out to be correct, thankfully, was that, again, schools won't care. They just want a number. And to me, that was a much more stark difference in test experiences than this is going to be.
Totally.
So
big differences both, but that one was radical.
Yeah. Yeah. And schools, again, didn't bat an eye. They didn't, again, categorize people or cordon people off. You're a flex person. We have to judge you by this metric. You're a non-flex. We judge you by something else. It was business as usual. This will be too. So again, don't let schools' opinions of you affect when you choose to take this test.
Yeah, you weren't a flex test taker. You weren't a current test taker. You're not a August 24 no LG taker. You're a 155, a 160, a 165, whatever you may be. That's what they care about. So there is no question whatsoever. That's how it's actually going to operate.
Perfectly said.
Well, almost done here, John, but a few questions for us that came in that I thought were interesting and kind of relating to the overall future of things. The first question was, do you guys think a new version of Logic Games will ever come back to the LSAT?
Oh, man, my fingers are cramped from crossing. But no, not likely. In fact, so unlikely that I'd have to just say a blanket no. I think
Yeah,
it's gone for good.
I mean, we explained how it's a lawsuit that got them into this position.
Right.
And, I'd actually tweeted about this. It got picked up by a lot of the legal community. And a lot of the lawyers were at first like, oh, they're just making it easier. This generation, they don't know what difficulty is. And I just laughed. I was like, they did this because of a lawsuit. You're a lawyer. Maybe you should do your research. And so coming back with a new version of it, is it possible? Sure. I think maybe they'll cast around for ideas if there's real problems with the statistical nature of this, but they've convinced themselves that the statistics back them up. So for me, the answer is no. I don't see this anytime soon. Call me in 10, 15 years, maybe, depending upon the results that we've seen, the happiness, even the changing fortunes of the test industry with the GRE not rising up to be as strong as it originally was. There's all sorts of factors that could make a play here, but that I don't really see it. So I'm going to agree with you, John, and say that's a no-fly zone.
Yeah.
The other question.
Don't throw away your Logic Games Bible, but keep it mostly just for sentimental value.
My poor Logic Games Bible.
I know, buddy. I know this hit you really close to home.
The first book that I wrote, near and dear to my heart. And of course, that's the other question that we've gotten is, how does this affect PowerScore? How does this affect you, Dave? You're the one that wrote the Logic Games Bible. How do you feel about it? You're known for it. Well, hey, I'm bummed out. Like I said, that was the first book that I ever wrote. It's certainly a publication that I feel very strongly about. But the interesting thing, and John, you know this from having hung around with me for years, is I don't think that's the best book that I've written. I think the Logical Reasoning Bible was the better book overall. I felt it was the more monumental achievement because it was harder to do overall. Logic Games just unfolded for me in a way where I was like, no one had ever really written about it. No one had systematically deconstructed it when I put that book out first. These days, modern test takers have a wealth of opportunities to go to various companies that are pretty solid at this. And I like to take a little bit of their credit because I think they read my book at one point and were like, hey, that's pretty good. We could use parts of this. So I'll take a broad stroke of credit there. But at the same time, when I first put the LG book out, there was nothing like it. There was no individual book on Logic Games. Kaplan and Princeton tended to talk about it in a way like, it's really hard. If you can't do it all, skip a bunch of them.
Right.
It wasn't systematic. But I didn't find that book challenging to put together. The LR book was the one where I felt like this actually is something that doesn't exist at all either, but it has got a much greater scope. It's much more disorganized as a general section than Logic Games. And so I felt like it was more challenging to put it together in a cohesive way. So losing Logic Games hurts me, but I'm not at all worried because I know that we have a really advanced cohesive strategy for attacking logical reasoning. So having more of it only helps us. I think our competitors are actually going to be hurt badly by this loss. I think everybody in the field gets hurt by it, but I don't think we're going to suffer to the same extent that many of our friends and colleagues at other companies will.
Yeah, I've got two comments on that. The first is you're absolutely right. You are, without question, the most robbed man in the LSAT world. Your pocket's constantly being picked, especially when it comes to Logic Games. And we've seen it, and most of it's been pretty overt and callous, and funny if you don't have a personal stake in it. Annoying when you do, which we do. But secondly, and I keep saying this to students who are asking me, because there's a lot of people out there mourning this loss, and I count myself among them. One thing that has given me a lot of comfort in this is that we do logical reasoning better than anyone else in the industry. And I can say that without a blink, without a flinch. We're better at it than anyone else is. Games, to me, the nature of it is such that even, say, middling or marginal companies can do a really good job with Logic Games. That can become kind of a focal point and a feather in their cap because that section can be beaten in various ways. Logical reasoning can too, but it's an awful lot harder. This is why that book was harder to write, frankly. But having written that book and us having kind of mastered that section too, I'm kind of excited for our students in particular to have this opportunity where logical reasoning is now such a fundamental focus because they are going to get the best logical reasoning system, techniques, methodology possible through us. And again, I don't say that to like self-aggrandize or brag. We're generally pretty humble as we go through this. Even when our crystal ball corrections are correct, we still,
We're not that humble about those anymore.
fair enough.
We shouldn't be.
We could definitely grab for larger horns, to toot. This to me is one of those things with LR where we genuinely are the best. So the fact that that's now going to become the centerpiece of the LSAT is, again, it's bittersweet. That's the sweet.
Yeah, that is a sweet part. And it's, that's a bold claim to make.
I know.
Obviously, I agree with you. And I would say one of the best ways to do that is go take a look at the explanations that are out there for LR. When you or I get the opportunity to explain LR questions, I think our explanations are very fluid and clear thinking, and they also relate back to a systematic way of approaching this. And I don't always see that with LR explanations. I see it a lot more with LG explanations, as you alluded to, because LG is like, well, R goes first, and that means, according to the second rule, that S goes fourth. It's very much dominoes fall, and most people can follow that. LR has a lot more nuance with understanding argumentative positions and how they impact various aspects of what's being said. You have to be more skilled, in my opinion. And there are a few people, I think, doing this in the LSAT field who are skilled with LR. There's not many, though. So the big thing to me that I'm most positive about is, sure, we lose logic games and I love doing it and I loved explaining them. It gives me more time to focus on LR and to spend more time talking to people about it, explaining it, working on techniques and so forth. So there are silver linings, and sunny skies after all of this. And it gives us more time to focus on RC as well, which is a section that I think, there's definitely room for improvement as well. We didn't really talk about it that much because it's not the one being doubled. So ultimately, I feel really good about the direction of things going, even though I will forever lament the loss of a good friend in logic games.
Yeah, let me give people a quick pro tip, which is if you really want to measure the quality of an LR system, let's call it, the real yardstick to me is how well explained wrong answer choices are. Do you have an ability, a technique, ultimately a system in place to eliminate wrong answers for good reasons consistently? And if you do, and we do, then you're going to beat this test. You're going to crush that section because all of the danger is in those wrong answers. If what you're hearing about wrong answers is, we know this is trash, and that's the extent of it, shame on everyone involved, but that's not good enough, and that's not going to prepare you for what is now going to be 2/3 of your score.
You just struck a chord with me, man.
Oh, okay. I thought you.
And I'll tell you.
I'm naming no names. I'm agnostic.
No, there's no names. Maybe I'll name some names.
My fingers are not pointed.
This is kind of a thing that Kaplan used to, and I don't know if they still do, but they used to a long time ago tell their instructors when they were teaching.
Names.
Right. Yeah, I just did. They used to say, if you don't know the answer in class to a student's question and you know the answer is wrong, just tell them it's out of scope. Because, a wrong answer is clearly not in the appropriate scope in some way, shape, or form. Like, this is your get out of jail free card. And whenever I heard that kind of, idea, I was always like, but that's really not always the correct answer as the way it is. That's just a Band-Aid for an instructor to get through something. The thing to me is every LSAT answer choice that is wrong, there is a specific reason that it is wrong. And you make a really good point, because it's like, if you go look at why answers are wrong and somebody is saying it's out of scope, geez, that's no good, we're not even consider it. Why did you consider it? Don't think about that one. That's because they don't actually know the specific reason that it is wrong. Look for answers that tell you it is wrong because of this. That is a true litmus test of kind of like the quality of LR. And like I said, there are some companies out there who I think do a really good job with various aspects of this. I know there's some companies that struggle with this. There's no national standardizing board that says this is good or bad at it. It's kind of like people can kind of jump in and out. So that might be a good way for people to make comparisons in terms of why they like one company's approach or another. Like you said earlier, I feel very comfortable with all of this. We feel very comfortable with the LR section and what we do with it. All right. That's an interesting point to end on it.
Yeah, I like it.
I love it. Didn't expect to be talking about that, but that is really
our nails
relevant.
came out a little bit there at the end. I like it.
It's okay. That's a fact. They used to say that.
It's just true.
I know that for the case, and I knew exactly why they were saying it, is because sometimes instructors didn't know why answers were wrong. And there's sympathy I have for the average person who teaches at a lot of other companies. Maybe they teach 1 or 2 classes a year. They're supposed to know 9,000 LSAT questions. Come on, that's really hard to do. So if you get caught out, that might be something that another company would say. We actually tell people not to say that because we think the blanket answer like that is dismissive. Try to help people understand the specifics. But let's not beat the dead horse there on that. On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment and a rating as well. And there is most definitely an admissions mailbag podcast coming soon. So if you have any specific law school admissions questions, please send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, we both regret the loss of Logic Games. For those of you who also regret it, get in there before June 2024. And for those of you who are celebrating the loss of Logic Games, well, you've got a bright and rosy future ahead. On that note, take care this week. Be safe out there. We will talk to you soon.